Our guest today is Mary Jo Bang, a very significant American poet, one of the most important American poets. And I would like to just qualify my statement by saying that she is one of those rare poets in our own time capable of making emotions work on language, stimulate language. Pain and happiness are experienced by the poet, but they are not necessarily the topic of his writing. The topic of his writing is the effect they produce on the language, which eventually is organized in a poem. And I believe this is a great contribution that Mary Jo Bang has given to American letters, contemporary American letters. I've asked her to read two texts to give you an idea of what she has been doing, she being the author of several books of poetry. The second text that she will read is from a book called A Doll for Throwing, which is probably, if I'm not mistaken, Jo, the latest of your publications. Right, so the first text would be The Downstream Extremity of the Isle of Swans. I'd like you to read that for our listeners.
The downstream extremity of the Isle of Swans. In the window a jacket cried, "Wear me, wear me," on a street of tall houses, all showing teeth, ash white of ice rut, of water on rock, many their eyes, all shaded by marmalade hoods. O cobra! I was foreign then, living in a limited range, disavowal lodged here and there. Everyone was saying, I would never, I would never. In the distance was a sapphire city, part early invention, part aviary. Everything depended on perspective. A viper's tongue could upend such a place. A blown leaf could bury each end. At night, opera wind raked through a field of hollow reeds, the song of disquiet dogs from Doomsday's third circle. The raging distemper finally forced me to breed a new brand of silence. The singlet before its disticus, doublet. We meet again, Moriarty, one said to the mirror in the morning. One said to the friend on the street. Every embassy and chancellery, shop and legation, gone. To what? A gash, a flat field, a field as far as the eye could see. See how all of that has been amended? Though nothing attenuates the hour of late gray, spittled rain, slip chain and bolt, the nights in a family of dreams, slaughter of heathen, falcon-headed henchmen. What was you that I stood waiting for day to become chintz over Swiss, dot after dot, measuring an immense span of glass, mouth tasting the burnt sun, the black sea, heart thumping behind its insensible hoof. See? And who would know it had ever been?
There were quite a number of images in your book. I spoke of language in abstract terms, but you have an interest in photography, or at least you started out as I read in your biography as a scholar of photography, or is it also a practicing photographer?
Practice.
And I'd like to know if there is something that was sort of left over from that period into your that you reutilize in your poetry, especially in The Doll for Throwing.
Well, I think it's character logic. I think looking is one of the things that I learned to do as a child. I was very silent. I didn't speak until I was over 3 years old, but I was watching all the time. And I think that whatever that combination of experience and the hardwiring of the brain, looking has always been very important to me, that kind of stimulation. And so I think that I brought that to photography and I brought that to poetry. And before photography, I was in medicine. I worked for 15 years as a physician assistant in gynecology. And I think the same characterological property is important there, looking in the microscope, finding the germ, looking at the body, finding the disease, the condition. So I bring that to everything I do.
Oh, that's very interesting. I didn't know about the assistant, the medical aspect of your career. And so I'd like you to read, if you don't mind, this our game, our party, our work, which is a shorter text, but then we'll say a few words about that also.
Our game, our party, our work. A fire can be hot flame and black carbon contagion that ends in a smoldering, that goes on emitting smoke and warming whatever is near. It was like that in the years when we moved from one place to another. Some say a war ends only when it becomes smoke rising from a book in a library destroyed by fire. And yet that fire sparks another. That library moves to another city and then to another. And so war, not once, but over and over. And everywhere there are those who care and those who don't. When metal and glass were becoming a building, the wealthy came in cars to gawk while the workers arrived on foot. Both brought deep scowls and the belief that if only the past would outlast today, they could be what they had never been, day after day, eternally happy. They said without saying that what we were building must be destroyed.
Now, would you say that the second text that you just read is tighter than the first, in the sense that there is a more of a consequential logic working in the second poem, as opposed to the more imagery-prone text of the downstream? Or, and is that just an impression for this poem, or would you say that your career has in fact developed in this direction?
I think that several things. One is I was writing in prose. These poems in A Doll for Throwing are all in dialogue with the Bauhaus school and design movement in Germany that lasted between 1919 and 1933. And I chose those blocks, they're justified on both sides, as an echo of the Bauhaus aesthetic. And I found that when I was writing in lines, instead of lineating them in the traditional lyric poetry format, I began to write differently. And I was actually surprised by that. But in addition, I think I've learned a lot from Dante. I've been working on Dante for the last 15 years. It took me 7 years to translate Inferno, and then it took me 8 years to translate Purgatorio. And in those 15 years, I began to admire Dante's ability to be as complicated with his ideas, but to create a narrative framework and a descriptive framework where there's a dynamism between what you're seeing and what someone's saying and what the idea that he wants to convey. And I think I'm getting better at that. I think that in the beginning, I didn't want my ideas to seem reductive, and I thought that complicating the language was the answer. And, you know, this was my third book, but really the second and third were being written at the same time. So I was still very young as a poet. And now this last book is the eighth book, and in between the Dante work. So I've learned a lot.
It's the first time that I hear that Bauhaus and Dante collapsed in one form of inspiration. I bow to that. Now, talking about Dante, since it's what really brought us together today, and you described your devotion, your lungo amore that you dedicated to the work of Dante. So far, you have translated Inferno, which is published, and Purgatorio, which is about to appear. The natural question is, do you think you're going to do Paradiso as well, or is it a question that I better not ask at this juncture?
I actually have begun, and I've finished the first 5 cantos. And but you know, because you are also an academic, you know that school is becomes all-consuming when you begin to teach. So I'm waiting for the summer and hoping to pick it back up at that point and see if I can't go forward. You know, Paradiso is a very different book. It's very thinky and very indebted to the both the Greek ideas of philosophy and the medieval idea of astronomy and astrology, sorry. And so I have to master all of that, just as I've had to master so much of Tuscan history and Greek mythology, because you know the traditional education today doesn't include studying Latin, Greek, and reading Ovid in the original. So every time I pick up this work by Dante, he forces me to expand my own education and my own channeling of a different era. And to do that, I feel I have to immerse myself in that knowledge, because otherwise there's no way I can understand what he was trying to do as a poet.
But now, can you tell us, because we started in a sense in medias res, but we have not yet told our listeners how this discovery of Dante came about. You have in your translator's note to the Inferno, you mentioned a very lovely encounter. Can you tell us again about how the idea dawned in you and then began a lifelong commitment?
Yes. I was reading a poem. It's more or less a found poem, and it's by the British poet Caroline Bergvall. And what she has done is, as an homage to Dante, she took all of the translations of the Inferno off of the shelves of the British Library, and she took the first 3 lines, the first tercet. She placed the original Italian at the beginning of the page, and then she listed all of the first stanzas of the existing translations on the shelf at that time, and there were 47 of them. She appended each stanza with the name of the translator and the date, and she put them in not in chronological order, but in the order of the alphabet of the first word. So it becomes a really interesting poem to read because it's totally based on repetition with revision. And it's rather mesmerizing to hear her read it. And she's created a sound piece, which is easily available online. And as I was reading all of those translations, and they ranged in time from Longfellow's in the 1860s to the most recent in the 2000s, I was struck with how antiquated the language remained. It never changed or rarely sounded contemporary with the era in which it was written after a certain point. And I began to wonder why. Why would a translator make that choice? And I felt that it was probably to indicate that the poem was very old, even though in English it's not using 1300s English. It's using something like, 17th or 18th century English, but there was a lot of thous and canst and odd syntaxes that we no longer use. And it occurred to me how would this sound in contemporary English? And given that so many scholars had preserved the original as closely as they could, and some of them had even followed the Italian word order, which seemed to me a failure of translation because the English word order isn't the same. I wondered, what would it sound like if I put these three lines in contemporary English? And I had these 47, Virgils, as it were, to guide me in terms of how far you can push that Italian language. I came to myself in a dark woods. I found the right path had been lost. So it's fairly simple. Midway in the journey of our life, I came to myself in a dark wood. The right path had been lost. But no two translations were the same, which was rather astonishing. And it seemed like a lesson that there is no one right way to carry over one language into another. And then additionally, this is a poem. And poem has elements like sonic momentum and phonic echoes that actually create emotion in a poem. And so some of the translators clearly must have been guided by their desire to create a kind of poetic equivalence to Dante's Terza Rima. And as you well know, the English is rhyme poor compared to Italian. Some of them had given up and used prose because they didn't feel like it could be done in rhyme. And so what was the point? But being a poet, I felt there was a point to making it a poem, to keeping the three lines, and instead I substituted what I felt were contemporary solutions to rhyme, which is assonance, alliteration, and internal rhyme, slant rhyme, sight rhyme, all of the other kinds of doublings that poets use today.
So you said your point of departure is actually available online, the poem you stumbled across in the British Library. Can you tell us how, is there a link that what should I look for if I wanted to hear?
The name of the poem is called Via 48 Dante Variations. And she has a website, and it's
Okay.
on her website.
Okay, very good. Of course, you mentioned the several translations of Dante that have been made into many languages. In fact, English came rather late to Dante, so to say, because I believe that the first English translation of Dante is, I wrote it down someplace, I think it's 1802. And then, of course, in America, it's even later with Longfellow in 1868. I've always been very charmed by the notion that Longfellow would gather his friends at his fireside and in what they call Dante's Club,
Yes.
and debate how to translate Dante. And in fact, you mentioned the very first three lines of the comedy. Longfellow writes, "Midway upon the journey of our life, I found myself within a forest dark," which is one of those constructions that doesn't really hold in English. You should be dark forest. And for the straightforward pathway had been lost. And then you have, I think a very good translation was that by Mandelbaum, by Alan Mandelbaum, because of his incredible ear for the endecasyllable, which is difficult to retain in English, which is sort of iambic pentameter inclined. But Alan made the endecasyllable sound in English. In fact, he has a beautiful beginning. When I had journeyed half my life away. I thought it was a great line, and I found myself within a shadowed forest, for I had lost the path that does not stray. So we also have sort of rhymes at work. And then there's Mary Jo Bang, and she says, stopped mid-motion in the middle of what we call our life, I looked up and saw no sky, only a dense cage of leaf, tree, and twig. I was lost. Now that's, you see, the word lost appears in both in Longfellow and in Mandelbaum, but in your translation is so much more powerful. It's at the end of the tercet, and it's what you stay with. Okay, you know, we all have the forest, we all have the darkness, but I was lost, which is something that anyone could say. How do you feel? Well, I feel lost, okay? So it seems to me that while most translations have tried to take English and bring it back to Italian, you've done the reverse. You've taken, you have imagined what a contemporary of Dante would have felt and sensed in hearing that language, and said, look, it's not a question of translation, it's a question of homology. We bring it over and we see what a contemporary English-speaking person would hear if Dante were to speak English today, right? Now, I have to say that in this process, sometimes I had to resort to footnotes, because what is contemporary to an American reader may need some explanations to a non-American readers or non-British readers. For instance, you at one point brought into your work the Iron Maiden, and I didn't realize there was a heavy metal group of singers, and I had to call friends and said, have you ever heard of the Iron Maiden? And then I looked them up, and they are anything but maidens, but they're certainly iron. But so I mean, it's very interesting that I think I believe that you have done what Pound has always wanted to do, although he never proceeded this way. He's always tried to bring English to close to 13th century Italian, thee, thou, haveth, haven't, etc., with all those THs which are so difficult to pronounce. Yet, he's the same person who in the cantos says the philologists obscure the text. So, not philology, but philologists. So they are trying to be so close to the original, and they don't offer us a real bridge between the original work and today. Now, if you don't mind, I think we should read some of the differences, and I would like you to take a minute to locate Canto 5 in Inferno, the very famous episode of Paolo and Francesca, and which has some really great lines. All school kids in Italian, at least those of my generations, memorized quali colombe dal desio chiamate, as turtle doves called onward by desire. That's Longfellow. How would you read that in your translations, that particular passage? Maybe I should read it first in the Mandelbaum translation, okay?
Okay.
And it's even as doves, when summoned by desire, borne forward by their will, move through the air with wings uplifted, still to their sweetest nest, those spirits left the wrecks where Dido suffers, approaching us through the malignant air. So powerful had been my loving cry. O living being, gracious and benign, who through the darkened air have come to visit our souls that stain the world with blood. If he who rules the universe were friend to us, then we should pray to him to give you peace, for you have pitied our atrocious state. And then Francesca, who is speaking here, describes how she was describes her falling in love with Paolo, and she says, love can quickly seize the gentle heart, took hold of him because of the fair body taken from me. How that was done still wounds me. Love that releases no beloved from loving took hold of me so strongly through his beauty that, as you see, it has not left me yet. Love led the two of us unto one death. That would be Alan Mandelbaum's rendition of that famous passage.
Yes. Like doves glide to a beloved dovecote, compelled by some strong desire, wings outstretched and steady on, they came, leaving behind Dido and her kind, through the vicious air, drawn near by the mere politeness with which I'd address them. You, still alive and all, you're very kind to have braved this brutal air to visit us after we've muddied the world with our blood. If the ruler of the universe were our friend, we'd ask him to give you peace, since you've shown us pity in spite of our terrible wickedness. We can tell you whatever you'd like to know, as long as the wind is calm, as it is now, and we can hear you and you us. I was born in Ravenna, on the Adriatic coast, where the Po River and its feeder streams peacefully drift off as they empty out to sea. Love lit a fire in my lover's gentle heart. He fell in love with the pretty girl I was. I still resent the way that girl I was taken from the world. Love, which is impossible to not return when one is loved, made me love him back, so that even now we're one in hell as we were in the world. Love led us to one death.
Right, above and beyond issues of translation, and I think your approach is the one that was really not at all followed until you decided to do this, because all other translations have moved back to Dante. You are bringing Dante towards us. However, that line, love that makes it impossible for someone who's loved not to love back, has been very the subject of a lot of controversial interpretations, of course. You seem to have chosen Boccaccio's idea that if you are intensely loved by someone, inevitably you are loved back. You're going to love back, which is not always the case. I don't know, in our own experience, sometimes we feel that we've been very much in love with someone who did not heed that solicitation. There is, of course, another interpretation, which is not so common, but it is also in some of the ancient commentaries, namely that loving back is actually forbidden. That is to say, that's why Paolo and Francesca are among the lustful, right? I mean, after all, this is a very strange situation. You have sinful ladies here. You have Dido, you have other Semiramis, etc., etc. Poor Francesca, all she did was fall in love with a man that she thought was going to be her husband too, on top of everything else. So she was cheated into marrying someone whom she hadn't seen, and then of course she fell in love with the person that she had been attracted to or to begin with. So the idea is, on the one hand, okay, you love, you're loved back. The other idea is that God does not perdona, does not forgive those who love back, because in fact they would be detracting from the love they owe him, whatever your God is. And how many times have you were, because as you said, you not only you translated Dante, but you steeped yourself in medieval culture. You had to spend a lot of time learning about Ovid and Statius and so on and so forth, which was not what you had started with. Some of these poets would be part of the curriculum for any Italian high school student, but coming from a completely different culture, you have to acquire them at a later or different stage. How many times have you encountered this sort of difficult, this crucible, this crossroads, and in your approach to the culture of Dante?
Well, I think that my choices in that passage were based on the commentary I read, and I would read multiple commentaries that said that this was part of why Francesca is in hell, is that she is still blaming something else for her own decisions. So she is saying, I had no, I had no ability to resist. Because he loved me, I had to love him back. And I think that what I have done is not take her position, but to do what I thought Dante wanted, which is to represent someone who has deceived themselves. And that's why they're in hell, poor Francesca. And she's still, all the people in hell, as you know, they haven't come to terms with their own responsibility. So Farinata hasn't come to terms with his arrogance, and that's why he's still in hell. And the same with Francesca. She is not taking responsibility for her own part in this. So I think that one of the things I was guided by with all of the characters in both books is to create a sense of a three-dimensional character. And that's also one of my rationales for putting the poem in the vernacular, in the contemporary vernacular, as Dante put it in the Tuscan vernacular, is because you don't get that individuation that happens with characters in a novel, in a film, in life. The moment someone speaks, we get an idea of who they are, what they say. We can see into their psyches, if not their soul, that how they think about things. And I felt that one of the disadvantages of keeping the language register elevated is all the people tend to sound alike, and you don't get the motivations that come out once you allow them to speak as themselves. And so in this moment, I'm not deciding what is good and what is bad. I'm relying on Dante's creating a character and putting dialogue into her mouth to represent what he wants to teach us, which is that, ethics are not situational. Values can't be situational. And even if somebody loves you, you are compelled by all sorts of things, religion in his viewpoint, but even in a respect for the social fabric, one has to make decisions based on what's best for more than just oneself.
Right. Now, I'm fascinated by the idea of the responsibility that you introduced. I was always struck by the fact that some of the people I expected to be in a particular area are not, and others that I didn't expect to find were there. So there's always a curiosity to find out what is the real reason why Dante positioned them wherever they are. And Francesca is a sticky case because, as I said, she seems to be the more innocent person on earth. She was cheated, she falls in love, which is a very natural thing to do, and then she is also condemned after life for having done just that. But I never looked at it from the point of view of the personal responsibility. So that's another thing I'm learning from your translation of Dante. Now, you mentioned some, I think in the introduction to the Purgatory, that the second book, when you translated the first book, you felt by far more experimental, much more less constrained, let's say. Whereas with Purgatory, you felt a little more I felt a little less daring. Okay, let me put it this way: is this something that you would say, or am I exaggerating in stating such a thing? Or and if it isn't an exaggeration, if that's exactly how you felt, why?
Well,
Why
I
were you
don't
so
think of
opposed to it?
yeah, I don't think of it now as a matter of daring. I think that my aim changed. When I first began that day when I read the Carolyn Bergvall poem, I was just playing. I had no idea I would translate the Inferno, much less Purgatorio. I was just, it was summer, and academics have time on their hands, and they get to do things that they don't ordinarily get to do. And I was reading this book of poems by Carolyn Bergvall. And when I came across this, I had the idea, as I said, how would I do this? And how would I do it if I already had and knew that there were all of these previous translations? And so I began. And after I had done the first 3 lines, I thought, this was fun, let's do more. And I went to my own bookshelf and got the Charles Singleton translation, which was the one I had, which is in prose, but with lots of archaicisms. And using him as my Virgil, I did the next 3 lines and then the next 3. But then it occurred to me that I had taken permission from all of those other translations that Bergvall had given me for the first one, and now I was relying on just one. So I went to the library and I brought home about 15 translations, ranging in time from Longfellow's to the most recent, which at that time was Robert and Jean Hollander's translation. And that gave me those parameters, not 47 of them, but at least 15 of them, in terms of how far you could push the language. And I kept working on it over that summer and finished the first canto. And it was only at that point that I had this idea, well, maybe I'll do the whole thing. And I thought, I could spend the rest of my life doing it. There's no deadline, and really, who cares what I'm doing here? It might be amusing to some people, but in that first canto, I was also being extremely self-indulgent. So it was more, it was more I don't even want to say an adaptation, but I had things like a Freud finger puppet show up. I had Dante saying, geez, Miss Louise. And it was only, so I was really having fun. But it was only when I then got a residency at Bellagio, at the Rockefeller Center there, to go and work on this translation. And I encountered this huge, unabridged Italian dictionary. And that interested me because then I thought, how can I do what I want to do here in terms of pushing Dante into the present, but being radically true to the original? And the dictionary began to help me do that. So my aims became totally different. And then when I got home, I finished 3 more cantos there. And when I came home, I ordered a Sassoni dictionary, and I began going forward. I revised radically that first very indulgent canto. And now I wanted to be true to the original. I wanted to be a translator instead of just somebody who was riffing off of Dante. But there were some indulgences that I found really difficult to give up because I liked what they were doing as a poet. And so there were a few things in a review by Robert Harrison in the New York Review of Books. He mentions that there are some unforced errors. And I feel like those are the very things he was talking about. I didn't have to do those. But I indulged. But once I finished it, I mean, after 34 cantos, I had learned, I felt, how to do what I wanted to do, but to have, and by this time, this deep, deep respect for Dante and the success of this poem, and also how radical the poem was in its own time, and that I wanted it to be radical, but I didn't want it to veer off into something that might even seem like a parody. Um, and there is a book, a translation of Inferno, by Kieran Carson, the now deceased Irish poet, and he uses terza rima, and so he gets pushed into word choices that are humorous or that are ridiculous sometimes. And he goes up and down the poetry thermometer from Faust to Virgil calling Dante a dolt. And but my concern about that was that I felt it undermined the gravity and the beauty and the seriousness of the work itself. So instead, we began to appreciate this tour de force by a poet taking Dante and keeping the terza rima. So I wanted to do something different from that. I wanted to make the poem be radical, but also to speak as Dante spoke about the social fabric and what our own self-interest, sin, if you think of it religiously, um, but ethical lapses, if you want to be secular, what it does to the social fabric. And that there's a kind of price that society pays. And of course, in hell, he comes up with these ingenious punishments that match the sin as a way to show that the punishment, but it also, I think, there's a resonance with what happens in society when these people are acting this way. So that's what I wanted to do. And I
Now,
feel that I got better at it.
sure, of course, but I appreciate it. But I'd like to go back to question to an issue we approached very slightly before, namely the impact that Dante had on your own poetry when you started with, without formulating a precise plan, but because I would say almost out of pleasure, out of you found attracted to the idea of translating Dante without having a very specific idea on how to do it, and that as you moved in more intimately into the text, I suppose you were writing your own poetry. I suppose there was a line of influence, not an anxiety necessarily, but some sort of an influence, some sort of Dante must have meant something as you were writing Major Bach's poetry. Would you say that that impact has remained intact, or it went through a series of modifications, and now that you have a slightly different approach and a more precise idea on how to render Dante into demotic popular English, that will affect your poetry in a different way? Because I notice, as I mentioned, the difference between the poem we read at the beginning and the idea of these prose poems that from Adolfo Throwing. So I was, it's while in the very first poem, there's a dynamic that I would call Dantean, more explicit. In the prose poems, I would feel less drawn to that conclusion. Well, maybe I'm wrong, but would you comment on that a little?
I think that Dante is not the only effect that has been present during these 15 years. So one of the things I noticed in Purgatorio compared to Inferno was I think I could see Dante grow as a person and age. And he became deeper. He became, in Inferno, there are all these sharp elbows trying to make points about people who he wants to embarrass and to critique. And a lot of those the contemporaries of his who had to do with his own exile are also present in some degree, however masked they are. And certainly with Boniface, he's not masked at all, the Pope. So I think that one ages, and I have, and one learns. And as long as one keeps reading, writing, being in the world, you will learn and you change, and you're impacted by all of your experiences. And I've had many experiences since I began translating Inferno, so that the same is true of the books. I'm working to put together a new book, and it will be interesting because I'm not writing in prose anymore, so it doesn't have that whatever those elements were that made me write differently. And each book has a different purpose. Not purpose, that's probably not a good word, impulse behind it. And the poems in the newest book, that is not yet a book, are completely motivated by something quite different from the books in A Doll for Throwing, except both of them, and maybe we could say all of my work, is coded in some way to create a speaker who goes on stage and speaks about the things that I feel are important. So I put on a costume. I'm the stage manager. I'm the props person. I'm the costume designer. I'm the audience. I'm the playwright, and I'm the actress. And so whenever I get up on stage, I have things I want to say to the world. That changes over time. The world changes. So that I think that Dante's only a piece of that.
So we were saying that it is an astonishing fact that Dante dedicates so many lines of poetry to an issue of poetics, and he offers his solution, the solution of the Dolce Sti Nuovo, in opposition to other schools of poetry. And in fact, it has a great line uttered by one of the people who did not belong to his coterie, saying, "Oh, now I understand what kept me from the line that you and your followers and your fellow travelers followed." So this is it's heartening. It's in a sense reassuring, because it means that perhaps poetry will reassume a more important social role in our own time, and the fact that Dante keeps on supplying energy to the cause of poetry is very, very interesting. So I suggest, as I was mentioning the fact that or maybe I wasn't mentioning, but I'll mention it now, that Pasolini was one of the people in the 50s, in the 1950s, that really devoted a lot of energy to the cause of poetry and to the social function of language used at a poetic level. And Pasolini himself tried to not translate, but to recreate some of the cantos of Inferno, la Divina Mimesis, or the Divine Mimesis. And now I'd like to perhaps at the end to wrap it all up, to look at the passage that I mentioned in Purgatorio, where Bonaggiunta speaks of his failure and praises Dante's innovative poetry. And I think the best way to do it is to read first Longfellow, then Mandelbaum, and then Mary Jo Bang. Okay, so I am now starting at Canto 26 of Purgatorio, and line 49. And I read the following lines. this is Buonaggiunta speaking to Dante, and according to Longfellow. But say, if him I here behold, who forth evoked the new invented rhymes, beginning, ladies that have intelligence of love, and I to him, one am I who, whenever love doth inspire me, note, and in that measure which he within me dictates, sing and go. Oh, brother, now I see, he said, the knot which me, the notary and Guittone, held short of the sweet new style that now I hear. And in Mandelbaum translation, we have, but tell me, do I see before me the one who brought out the new verse that begins, you women who have the intellect of love? I answered him, I am that one for whom, notably, when love inspires me, I go deep inside and make meaning signify.
No, that's Mary Jo Bang.
That's
That's not Mandelbaum.
sorry, that's Mary Jo Bang. Let me go back because that I wanted to comment on that. So let me go back to Mandelbaum says, but tell me if the man whom I see here is he who brought the new rhymes forth, beginning, ladies who have intelligence of love. I answered, I am one who, when love breathes in me, takes note. What he within dictates, I, in that way, without, would speak and shape. Oh, brother, now I see, he said, the knot that kept the notary, Guittone, and me short of the sweet new manner that I hear. And now, if you don't mind, Mary, I'll read Mary Jo Bang, because there's something I want to utterly emphasize. But tell me, do I see before me the one who brought out the new verse that begins, you women who have the intellect of love? I answered him, I am that one for whom, notably, when love inspires me, I go deep inside and make meaning signify. Oh, brother, I can now see, he said, the knot that held Notaro, Guittone, and me back from what I can hear in the sweet new style. Now, what I was really pleased to see was that I go deep inside and make meaning signify. I find signs appropriate to meaning. And I'm afraid to say, well, actually, I'm happy to say that neither Longfellow nor Mandelbaum even came close to that statement. And then I see, it seems to me that that's what the task of poetry is today. So I'd like to thank you very much. If you have something to say about this, to comment a little bit on your lines, I would be very happy to hear this combination of meaning and signification.
Well, and I think that if we can go on just two more stanzas there, he said, I also see very well how your pen strokes track more closely the inner dictator, which certainly didn't happen with ours. Beyond putting in more of whatever you like, one style looks much like the other. Then, as if satisfied with that, he fell silent. And I think that that inner dictator is really interesting. It's not just to make meaning signify, but that you are tracking something inside that is almost like the surrealist notion of trance writing, but it's curated. And I think that Dante's onto something about poetry with that. And I think that he's also using this dismissal by the speaker as he doesn't really get it. It's not that, because beyond putting in more of whatever you like, you know, whatever you like, that's essential. That following the inner dictator. And I think that Dante's trying to show that, and that's the essence of the sweet new style, is a kind of getting into interiority much more than using symbol and myth and all of these received stories that poetry has relied on in the past. And that's very modern. And in fact, that is modernism, where poetry begins to mine everything that came before, but to try to position it in this brand new world, which is very different from the world before.
Well, that's very, very illuminating. I thank you very, very much for your comments, and I'd like to say to our listener that, of course, your poetry is widely published, and anyone can look up Mary Jo Bang and see that, and see the number of books that she has written and published by Grey Wolf, most of them. And in fact, especially the translation, so to say, of Purgatorio and Inferno. I believe Purgatorio is about to appear, but Inferno has been there since 2012, I believe. And so we all stand a good chance to dive back into Dante through the magnificent work of Mary Jo Bang. Thank you very much for being with us. And don't forget that sometime soon we'll convene a major encounter, a gathering of the tribes at the Casa Italiana and the Italian Cultural Institute here in New York. And I hope that you will be able to join us then, as soon as COVID-19 disappears from our lives. Thank you very much again, Mary Jo. And
thank you, Luigi.
Bye-bye.
Bye.